Title of this video is Margaret MacDonald's Revelation. Uh, this is the woman for which Schofield and Darby used her information to produce a framework for today's 20th century or 21st century rapture. My understanding it happened back in 1835. They say 1840, give or take 5 years. Anyway, let me read this. Margaret MacDonald has often been either upheld as a visionary or blamed for inventing the pre-tribulation rapture of the church. This is a very complicated matter, and people tend to take opposite sides without knowing many facts. Margaret MacDonald, a young Christian living in Port Glasgow, Scotland, certainly received a revelation which was then written and rewritten, circulated, and first published in 1840, some 10 years later. Not long after her revelation, she wrote down her account of everything and sent handwritten copies of it to a number of Christian leaders. The Morning Watch, a leading British publication, quickly copied some of her distinctive notions. Her revelation was first published in Robert Norton's Memoirs of James and George MacDonald of Port Glasgow, 1840, pages 171 through 176. Norton published it again in the Restoration of Apostles and Prophets in the Catholic Apostolic Church, 1861, pages 15 through 18. Some writers have linked Margaret to the young lady known only as Mrs. M&M, who had, they said, stood up in a Irvingite service in London in 1832 and given a word that purportedly spoke of the rapture before the second coming. At that time a novel idea, but not wholly unheard of, as we shall see. Others leveled the charge that she was amongst the company of false prophets who were causing disturbances in Edward Irving's church at the time, hitting at a demonic source for the pre-trib rapture. Robert Baxter, who had himself been part of that company, later wrote that these prophets and visionaries spoke under the direction of demonic power. However, as author David McPherson now confirms, the person who stood up in Irving's church was a Mrs. John Bates Cardell, and certainly was no connection to the Margaret MacDonald who circulated a written revelation she had received while studying the scriptures in 1830 in Scotland. But more importantly, and the reason for this article, the pre-trib rapture cannot be attributed to Margaret MacDonald's revelation, since its teaching quite plainly is not there. What is there, I think you will agree as you read it, is interesting in another way because it prefigures much of today's revivalist teaching. The revelation was altered several times during the course of its circulation, and portions were omitted that spoke specifically of the Antichrist being revealed in the fiery trial of purging that would result from his appearance. Omitted portions are marked in red in the transcript below. They appeared in the 1840 version of R. Norton's transcript, but were missing from the later 1861 book, presumably because they were now an embarrassment to the emerging pre-trib dispensationalist viewpoint. Was Margaret a dispensationalist? Margaret was herself more influenced by the prevailing historicist view of the day than the futuristic view that developed in later years. Two portions of the revelation in particular seem to indicate a post-trib belief. These portions are marked with emphasis now. It is hard work indeed using this revelation to prove that Christians will be taken out before the tribulation or arrival of Antichrist. Historicism, I'm pronouncing that word right, the belief that the prophecies of Revelation are being worked out slowly through history since the time of the Ascension, have become the accepted view by the 19th century. However, is this what the early church believed? Scholars looking at the teaching of the apostles and the early church fathers have come to the conclusion that historicism was not held by them to be the correct interpretation of Scripture. They were futurists and premillennialists. This is. That is, they believed the words of Revelation, the prophecies of Daniel, and the warnings and promises of Jesus to refer to definite, literal future events, and that the return of Christ would come before and lead to a literal 1,000-year reign of righteousness and peace on earth. It was only after Emperor Constantine gave his official sanction to the Christian faith that the view developed that Christ was now reigning on earth through the government of the church and millennialism, and that prophecy was not fulfilled literally but allegorically in and through the church. However, views varied, and from time to time other opinions on prophecy become popular. People begin to look for a greater measure of peace and stability on earth than that which provided by a fallen church. In 1703, Daniel Whitby taught a version of the post-millennialism, with the church coming into a golden age of victory and power before the Lord's return. The historicist view of prophecy attached ever more fanciful historical interpretations to the prophecies of Revelation, which time and again proved false. The majority of Protestant Reformed teachers up to the 19th century were a millennial historicists. They did not read prophecy literally, but symbolized everything down to the smallest detail in an attempt to fit events into the church era. Thus, the prophecies of Antichrist were being fulfilled in the papacy and successive popes as an ongoing present evil. However, this... Okay, I lost my place here. However, around the 19th century, there was a move towards a futuristic interpretation of prophecies. This did not happen all at once, but was developed in stages through various scholars, some of them within the Roman Catholic system and some outside. Ribera, Franciscus de Ribera, in 1580 wrote a book that was a mixture of amillennialism, historicism, and futurism. He began with the seals opening in the time of Christ, but much of the book of Revelation he interpreted literally at some future date. By the way, it's my guess that maybe this Ribera guy is probably also the one that might have written the 1619 prophecy, which had no signature on it. Anyway, continuing, Lacunza, Manuel de Lacunza was another Catholic who defied the Roman traditional beliefs in order to write secretly and under threat of discovery about prophecy from a futuristic viewpoint, though many of his beliefs and theories would seem strange to us today. His book, The Coming of Messiah in Glory and Majesty, completed in 1790, was written under the pen name of Ben Ezra to avoid exposure. It was placed on the Index of Forbidden Books by Rome in 1824. However, Edward Irving obtained a copy and translated it into English. From his forward, we see that Irving disagreed profoundly at times with Lacunza's views. Nevertheless, the futuristic interpretation of prophecy was making a welcome comeback from the days of the early church, and soon more and more Christians studying the scriptures came to the conclusion, as Lacunza had, that much of the end time scenario was yet to come. Lacunza and the Rapture. It has often been asserted in ignorance of Lacunza's book that this man was the first to propose a pre-trib rapture. Actually, Lacunza did nothing of the sort. His only reference to the removal of the saints makes it plain that they had endured throughout the tribulation. However, he suggested that there would be a short period of time of 45 days between the Epiphany, the appearance of the Lord in glory from heaven, and the parousia, the coming to earth. Lacunza suggested that the 45 days would be a time of judgment upon earth where the wrath of God was poured out on God's enemies. The millennium reign of Christ would follow. However, this is a very different doctrine from the invisible catching away and resurrection of the believers before the tribulation. The pre-trib rapture is not to be found in Lacunza's book. End of this section.